Texas executed death row inmate Steven Lawayne Nelson today for the 2011 murder of a pastor. Nelson was...
There's many innocent people here on death row or in prison that shouldn't be here. It's hard at times, you know, because you're waiting to be put to death. So that kind of breaks a little part of you every day. And sometimes I have to catch myself, you know, for being overwhelmed and stressed out, you know, and like force myself to eat because it does that to you where you just don't want to do nothing. Her being a witness of my execution, it's up to her, you know, but I really don't want her to see that, me getting pumped full of drugs and being overdosed with drugs to kill me, to make my heart stop. I think that will leave a bad impression, you know, that will override the good memories we had over the years. She'll always close her eyes and see that.
How does a man feel knowing he'll never again see the outside world? For most people, that thought alone would crush them. But Steven Nelson didn't seem to care. He wasn't the kind of inmate who stayed quiet, kept his head down, or tried to do his time. Even behind bars, he was dangerous. Nelson was already locked up for murdering a pastor in Arlington, Texas, but he went ahead and killed another inmate inside jail. Witnesses recalled Nelson laughing afterward, then pretended to play air guitar over the man's body. In this video, we'll take you through Steven Nelson's final 24 hours and the brutal path that led him to the death chamber. Welcome to the executioner's pen, where we dive into real crime cases, uncover the facts, and explore the truth behind every story. Kindly hit that like button and subscribe to support the community. It all started on March 3, 2011, at NorthPointe Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. That Thursday morning was quiet. Inside the church, 28-year-old Pastor Clint Dobson sat at his desk. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and the kind of man who remembered your name and really meant it when he asked how you were doing. Across the room, 69-year-old church secretary Judy Elliott typed away at her desk. She was faithful, kind, and known for never missing a day of work. Neither of them knew what was about to happen. That morning, 24-year-old Steven Nelson walked through the church doors, but he wasn't there to pray. He was there to rob. What happened next was brutal and fast. Dobson was assaulted before a computer extension cord was used to strangle him, and he was subsequently smothered with a plastic bag. As for Elliott, she was severely beaten, causing her to suffer internal bleeding in her brain and traumatic injuries to her face, head, arms, legs, and back. After leaving the two for dead, Nelson stole Dobson's laptop, a cell phone, Elliott's credit cards, and Elliott's car. Nelson later used the credit cards to purchase new clothes and jewelry, and also sold the laptop for money. Meanwhile, unable to reach her husband by phone, Clint Dobson's wife contacted Jake Turner, the church's part-time music minister. Turner agreed to go to the church and called Judy Elliott's husband, John, who quickly drove to the location. Upon his arrival, John used his passcode to enter the church, and upon entry, John noticed Dobson's office in disarray and saw a woman, whom he didn't initially recognize as his wife, severely beaten and lying on the floor. However, John did not see Dobson lying on the other side of the desk. John immediately called the police, and Arlington police officer Jesse Parrish discovered Dobson's body. Dobson was pronounced dead at the scene, while Elliott was rushed to the hospital. Despite the grim forecast by doctors and a heart attack during her hospitalization, Elliott survived her injuries. She was released from the hospital 2 weeks later and underwent 5 months of therapy and rehabilitation. A permanent combination of mesh, screws, and other metal components was used to support Elliott's face. Defense attorneys alleged that Elliott told a doctor that 2 men had assaulted her. An autopsy was later conducted by Dr. Nizam Pirwani, a medical examiner for Tarrant County, and results showed that Dobson's injuries were likely caused by a violent struggle, during which he tried to protect himself from blows, possibly delivered by the butt of a firearm. 2 of the wounds on his forehead appeared to have been caused by the computer monitor stand in the office. Dr. Pirwani stated that the injuries indicated Dobson was likely standing when he was first hit in the head and was struck in the back of his head as he fell. Dr. Pirwani certified that the cause of death was strangulation, caused by the plastic bag covering Dobson's face, which suffocated him. A memorial service was held at the church in remembrance of Dobson. More than 200 mourners were present at the service, and many remembered Dobson's kindness to the community. After 2 weeks in the hospital and 5 months of therapy, Judy finally returned home, her body held together with screws and plates. Her memory of the attack stayed sharp, and she remembered who had done it. By then, Steven Nelson was on the move. He sold Clint's laptop out of Judy's stolen car, used her credit cards at gas stations and malls, and even bragged to friends about robbing a pastor. During investigation, Nelson denied hurting anyone. At first, he admitted being at the church, but claimed he didn't do the killing. He told police he was just the lookout during a robbery, that others were involved, and that he didn't even know the building was a church. Nelson said 2 of his friends went inside first. According to his story, by the time he went in, Clint and Judy were already injured. He claimed all he did was grab a laptop and car keys, then left. He told investigators he had nothing to do with tying anyone up or putting a bag over Clint's head. But his version didn't add up, eventually linked Nelson to the murder. Nelson, who was supposed to report to his probation officer on the date of the murder but failed to do so, was apprehended by police after a warrant of arrest was issued in his case. The police uncovered the belongings of both Elliott and Dobson in Nelson's possession. There were bloodstains found on the shoes of Nelson, and forensic tests confirmed that the DNA of the bloodstains belonged to both Dobson and Elliott. Similarly, the fingerprints extracted from the scene of crime matched to those of Nelson. Surveillance cameras caught him using Judy's stolen credit cards at gas stations and shopping malls within hours of the attack. And to top it off, his own friends testified that Nelson bragged about robbing a pastor and even laughed about it. The mountain of evidence completely crushed the story he tried to tell investigators. When Nelson took the stand at his trial in 2012, he doubled down. He told the jury he didn't kill anyone. He said he thought it was just a regular robbery and claimed he didn't realize it was a church until he recognized Pastor Clint Dobson. He painted himself as someone who got in over his head, that he was only there to take a laptop, a car, and nothing more. But jurors weren't buying it. Judy Elliott, the church secretary who survived the attack, pointed directly at him as the man who tied them up and beat them. She remembered everything clearly. On March 19, 2012, Nelson killed Jonathan Holden. Holden was a 31-year-old inmate at the Tarrant County Jail known to struggle with mental health issues. Witnesses said Steven Nelson convinced Holden to fake a hanging so he would be transferred out of the unit. Instead, Nelson wrapped a torn jail blanket around Holden's neck, braced his feet against the bars, and pulled until Holden stopped breathing. Some inmates later said Holden had irritated others by muttering a racial slur shortly before the attack. What shocked everyone wasn't just the killing itself. It was what came after. Witnesses testified that Nelson laughed, broke into a little celebration dance, and even pretended to play air guitar with a broom over Holden's body. In court, Nelson never accepted responsibility. His defense suggested Holden might have taken his own life, but jurors heard detailed eyewitness accounts describing Nelson setting up the fake hanging and then strangling him to death. On October 8, 2012, the jury found him guilty of capital murder and attempted capital murder. Just 8 days later, they sentenced him to death. Right after hearing his fate, Nelson ripped apart a sprinkler system in the courtroom, flooding the place with black water. It was his last outburst before being shipped off to death row. To understand how Nelson ended up here, you have to look at his early life. Nelson was born in Ada, Oklahoma in 1987. He grew up in a violent and unstable home. Nelson had a brother and sister who was deaf and was a victim of childhood abuse and neglect. Nelson's mother left him at home by himself, sometimes for 3 to 4 days, and never paid much attention to her children, while Nelson's father was often absent in his life, and he was abusive towards his children and wife. At the age of 3, Nelson went to set fire to his mother's bed, which was in the living room. Nelson had several run-ins with Oklahoma's juvenile authorities at the age of 6, committing property crimes, burglaries, thefts, and aggravated assault. Despite attempts by officials to intervene through counseling and probation, he was incarcerated in a high-risk juvenile detention center at a young age due to his continued involvement in felonies. By 2011, Nelson assaulted his then live-in girlfriend and was indicted for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon after the victim filed a complaint against him. 3 days later, his girlfriend filed a non-prosecution affidavit to drop the charges, but the DA denied it because of his extensive record. He was subsequently placed on probation and sent to a 90-day program at the Intermediate Sanctions Facility. On October 1, 2012, Steven Nelson officially stood trial for the murder of Clint Dobson. Nelson was indicted on 1 count of capital murder and another count of attempted capital murder by a Tarrant County jury. The prosecution expressed their intent to pursue the death penalty for Nelson. During the trial, the prosecution argued that Nelson was the lone killer in the case of Dobson's death. They argued that the forensic evidence had effectively placed Nelson at the crime scene. They cited the evidence of his having stolen the belongings of the victims, selling Dobson's laptop, and using the victims' credit cards for shopping. The evidence against Nelson was mostly circumstantial, but the prosecution urged the jury to convict Nelson based on the circumstantial evidence that strongly incriminated him as the perpetrator of the murder. They described Nelson as a predator who committed a terrible crime for the victim's valuables. In his defense, Nelson testified that he was not the only one involved in the murder and pinpointed his 2 friends, Anthony Springs and Claude Jefferson, as the ones who murdered Dobson. Nelson claimed that he, Springs, and Jefferson entered the church together, and he stole Dobson's laptop, Elliott's keys, and Elliott's credit cards before leaving. He added that both Jefferson and Springs were together with the victims, assaulting them while he was outside acting as a lookout. He claimed that he was only guilty of robbing the victim, but denied killing Dobson or beating Elliott. However, both Jefferson and Springs had alibis at the time of the murder. Jefferson said he was at his university, attending a chemistry test, which was never confirmed as Nelson's lawyer questioned the professor, and they stated there was no chemistry test that day. At the same time, Springs's phone was over 30 miles away at the time of the murder. Nelson explained the presence of the victim's DNA on his shoe or the discovery of his broken belt pieces by stating he crawled under a table to grab a laptop bag at the murder site. On October 8, 2012, the jury found Nelson guilty of both capital murder and attempted capital murder. A sentencing trial commenced thereafter to decide whether Nelson should face the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the final submissions, the prosecution sought the death penalty for Nelson, stating that Nelson had a long criminal history since his childhood and also brought up evidence of his multiple incidents of rule-breaking and prison violence, including the killing of Jonathan Holden. They argued that Nelson was a lingering menace to society based on his lack of compliance with prison regulations and rehabilitative efforts, and multiple crimes before the murder of Dobson, and he deserved the ultimate penalty for his alleged heinous conduct of taking Dobson's life and assaulting Elliott. The defense, however, argued for a life sentence. They brought forward Nelson's troubled childhood and learning difficulties, among other mitigating factors, in favor of life imprisonment for their client. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Nelson had both attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and antisocial personality disorder. In their victim impact statements, Dobson's family and friends spoke of Dobson's good deeds during his lifetime as a pastor. Dobson's widow stated that her husband would be remembered fondly for his kindness and sense of humor. She condemned Nelson for his atrocities, stating that no one would remember him for destroying the lives of his victims. Dobson's father-in-law said in his victim impact statement he would never understand the terrible things Nelson did for a laptop and credit cards, similarly reprimanding Nelson for his crimes. On October 16, 2012, 25-year-old Steven Lawayne Nelson was sentenced to death by Judge Mike Thomas after all 12 jurors unanimously agreed to impose the death penalty. Reportedly, after his sentencing, Nelson flooded the courtroom with black fire-retardant liquid by breaking a fire sprinkler, in retaliation towards the judge and jury for sentencing him to death. After he was sentenced to death, Nelson was transferred to the Alan B. Polunsky unit, where he was incarcerated on death row for the next decade. During this period, Nelson appealed against his death sentence. On April 15, 2015, Nelson's direct appeal was dismissed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. On March 29, 2017, District Judge John H. McBride of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas rejected Nelson's appeal. On March 12, 2020, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld McBride's ruling and turned down Nelson's appeal. On June 30, 2023, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals again rejected a second appeal from Nelson. After spending close to 12 years on death row, Nelson received his death warrant and the execution order, which Judge Stephen Lawayne signed on June 10, 2024. The sentence was scheduled to be carried out on February 5, 2025. Nelson was set to be the first condemned inmate from Texas to be executed in the state in 2025. On November 15, 2024, a protest rally was held by a group of death penalty opponents to protest against Nelson's impending execution. A December 2024 report revealed that Nelson was one of the 4 condemned inmates from Texas to have their execution dates scheduled between February and April 2025. The response of many Christians to the impending execution of Nelson was divided. Some of the religious figures, including anti-death penalty activist Jeff Hood, argued that the teachings of the Bible demonstrated that the death penalty was not justified for Nelson, and his life should be spared out of mercy. However, some others, including members of Clint Dobson's church, supported the execution of Nelson, and First Baptist Arlington pastor Dennis Wiles, who was affiliated to the same church as Dobson, had previously affirmed his support to execute Nelson in a 2012 statement. As the Bible teaches us, God has placed the civil authority in our midst so that innocent people can live in freedom without fear, and so that guilty offenders can be appropriately punished. On January 28, 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected Nelson's last-minute appeal to stave off his execution. A final appeal was lodged to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was ultimately rejected on the afternoon of February 5, 2025, hours before the tentative timing of Nelson's execution. Nelson married a French woman named Helen Noah Dubois while he was in prison. He met Helen through a pen pal service in 2020, starting as friends and growing closer over shared life experiences. They married in 2023 through prison glass. No physical contact, but deeply meaningful. While Helen remained a steadfast presence, organizing support rallies and serving as a source of comfort and peace, and Nelson worried about how the execution would affect her, but ultimately honored her decision to be present or not. On February 5, 2025, Nelson's time ran out. 37-year-old Steven Lawayne Nelson was put to death by lethal injection in the Huntsville unit. Nelson was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. that evening after the drugs were administered to him. In response to the execution of Nelson, Dobson's family released a statement in remembrance of the late pastor. Clint Dobson loved people, and he loved God. He was always excited by the opportunity to unite the two. A believer in social justice, he led a diverse congregation and worked to make sure that everyone felt comfortable and welcome at NorthPointe. Nelson's final words were directed towards his wife, saying, "I will always love you no matter. Our love is uncontrollable. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." He even asked her to hug his dog for him. Judy Elliott survived the brutal church attack, but sadly passed away in 2024, a year before Steven Nelson's execution. When the day finally came in February 2025, it was her son, Bradley Elliott, who attended on behalf of his late mother. After witnessing the execution, Bradley gave a statement of grace and forgiveness. Nelson's final words had nothing to do with the people he killed. He didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did he mention his victims. Instead, his focus was on the woman he married while on death row. The file on Steven Lawayne Nelson is officially closed, but this investigation is far from over. We know that for every case that gets a final headline, there are thousands that go cold. Is there a case that's always bothered you? Maybe it's that one local mystery that never got solved. Or maybe it's a headline you saw from across the country, a case that just disappeared from the news, where the official story just doesn't add up. This is where you come in. Comment below with the one case, from any time, any place, that you believe the authorities got wrong or swept under the rug. We read every single comment, and your case might be the one we investigate next, uncovering the details they don't want you to know. But we can't do it without you. If you want us to investigate the cases that really matter, you have to do your part. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. Like this video, share this with everyone you know who's tired of easy answers. Don't just watch the news. Help us decide what to uncover. We'll see you in the comments.